Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynica, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Tuesday, June 23rd, 2026. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Professor Alexander Motyl, who is professor of political science at Rutgers University, Newark, and an expert on contemporary politics in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. Welcome, Professor. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And thank you for having me on your podcast.
Yes, and thanks for joining us again. To start off with, can you provide a short history of relations between Ukraine and the EU?
That's easy because most of the relations between the Ukraine and EU consist of a variety of agreements that fall short of anything approaching membership. So Ukraine expressed an interest in joining the EU immediately after independence in 1991. And one can trace the relationship by looking at the agreements that were signed since then. There was the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, the Eastern Partnership, eventually the Association Agreement in 2014, an action plan, a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. Anyway, all of these things are important in as much as they entail a closer relationship between Ukraine and the EU. But it was only in 2022, that is to say, roughly 30 years after independence, and very much as a consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that Ukraine formally became a candidate for membership. So it's taken 30 years to get to that point, and I suspect that were it not for Putin's invasion of Ukraine, we wouldn't be there. Now, does that mean Ukraine is about to join the EU? Well, that's a topic that we'll discuss today.
What happened when Ukraine's former president, Viktor Yanukovych, refused to sign the pending European Union Association Agreement in 2013? And was the agreement eventually signed by Ukraine?
The agreement was eventually signed later on in 2014, but his decision not to sign the agreement was very much the result of pressure exerted on him by Vladimir Putin, the illegitimate president of Russia. And that, of course, the decision not to sign the agreement sparked the Maidan Revolution. Immediately as soon as the news of that became known, students demonstrated, the police cracked a number of heads, and then the rest is history.
And what has been the position of the government of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky regarding European integration and application for EU candidate status?
Well, he's made it quite clear that he would like Ukraine to become a member of the EU immediately, and if not immediately, then as soon as possible. That's not going to happen. On the other hand, it's the appropriate demand. The EU responds only if it's pressured. So in that sense, it's quite appropriate and quite right, I think, for Zelensky to insist on maximalist demands in the hope that eventually some kind of compromise will be reached that'll satisfy both the EU and Ukraine.
Has the EU been in favor of Ukraine joining as a member? And did the Russian invasion of Ukraine have a significant impact on EU member states changing their minds?
Well, again, it's not a question. I mean, formally, the EU supports Ukraine. The EU is a broad institution. I mean, a variety of its top leaders have said that Ukraine deserves to be in the EU and so on, but that's not official policy. And besides, official policy has to be adopted by a unanimous vote. That's the major obstacle at this point in time. As you know, Viktor Orban, the former prime minister of Hungary, was decidedly opposed to EU membership for Ukraine, and his one vote would have derailed any progress. Now, thus far, the only progress that's been made is that Ukraine has become a candidate member, and negotiations regarding the first packet of laws have been opened, which is significant. But that having been said, Ukraine is making a fairly it's making progress. Um, it hopes to make faster progress, and it hopes that the EU will welcome faster progress. But the problem ultimately comes down to the fact that there are several countries that oppose EU membership for Ukraine. And as long as that's the case, that will be a non-starter. Now, Hungary, as I said before, was one of the key opponents. As we've just learned, Orban's successor, Peter Magyar, is also opposed to EU membership for Ukraine. And it's likely to be the case that Poland will be less than fully enthusiastic. The French will be less than fully enthusiastic. And ultimately, it's really just a question of one country. So as long as one country can say no, the whole process will be delayed or derailed.
On June 15th, 2026, all 27 EU member states unanimously supported and formally agreed to open the first accession negotiations cluster with Ukraine and Moldova. This is called Cluster 1 Fundamentals. What is the significance of this step? And how many steps will there be after this before Ukraine and Moldova become full EU members?
I believe there are something like 5 or 6 additional packets of legislation that need to be adopted. But the first one is arguably the most important because it deals with broad issues like rule of law, human rights, and so on. So passing that particular hurdle brings Ukraine significantly closer to membership than the other 5. But of course, it's a difficult hurdle to pass. I mean, I personally think Ukraine will certainly have the capacity to do so, but it may not be something that will automatically occur. It's been suggested that that Ukraine would be ready to join the EU in about 9 years. Now, that may or may not be the case. But the point is, it's going to be a long and laborious procedure. That said, it's a very significant first step because it means that finally Ukraine has starting negotiations regarding full-fledged membership. It's no longer an agreement regarding trade or association or cooperation or anything like that, which has been the case for the last 30 years. Now we're actually talking about a concrete step towards full-fledged membership. But there again, a word of caution. Ukraine can make as many steps as it can, and it's likely to fulfill the obligations sooner than 9 years. But ultimately, it all comes down to whether or not the EU can muster up a unanimous vote. And that's the big question.
So, is the 9 years a formal EU timeline, or is just that a consensus of observers who look at Ukraine in the EU?
It's the latter, it's the consensus. It just takes a longer period of time. And that's been the case in the past. Now, I want to emphasize an important thing. I mean, ultimately, the EU makes decisions for a variety of reasons. Technically, the decisions that it makes are supposed to be guided by the ability of a country to fulfill the requirements of EU legislation. So technically, it's really just a kind of neutral procedure. In point of fact, it's a very political procedure. Something like back in the early 2000s, when the EU expanded to include a large number of East European countries, it was clear to any objective observer that Romania and Bulgaria were not ready to join, or alternatively, if they were ready to join, then so too was Ukraine and Moldova, since all 4 countries were roughly at the same level of rule of law and so on. But the French wanted the Romanians to join. Everybody agreed that if the Romanians joined, then Bulgaria should join as well. So the decision was to a very large degree political. The same was true many, many years before that when the euro was adopted. All the countries that adopted the euro had to have a specific limit on their debts, and there was a lot of finagling taking place so as to meet that particular criterion. And as soon as they were admitted to the eurozone, they gave up those restrictions and then returned to business as usual. So the bottom line is that if the EU or if significant member states within the EU want Ukraine to join, and if they're willing to twist arms And if they're willing to bribe some members by additional monies, they can do that. And that's the good news. If Germany, France, and a number of other countries were to insist that this needs to be the case, they could probably push it through.
So, are the current obstacles for Ukraine to join the EU strictly political, or are there other obstacles such as economic ones?
Well, the economic ones are always going to be the key. I mean, politically, yes. I mean, the Hungarians, I think, more than anybody else, claim to be worried about the fate of the Hungarian minority in Zakarpattia province. The fate of that minority is actually perfectly fine. They're not being discriminated against, but the Hungarians insist that additional steps be taken. Well, in principle, that can be solved with some clever negotiations on both sides. The current Polish government under President Nawrocki has tied EU membership by Ukraine to the debate regarding the Ukrainian insurgent army and the tragedy in Volhynia in 1943. Those are political issues. But then again, they can be resolved as, if Zelensky and Nawrocki were to sit down and work out some kind of deal. But in principle, they can be resolved. I'm not sure that Nawrocki wants to resolve them. But the primary obstacle, or certainly a very important obstacle, is economic. If the EU, if Ukraine joins the EU, it will insist on significant transfers of resources, which would be its right, which means that monies that would go to Ukraine would not go to other member states. That alone is a concern. More important, perhaps, is the fact that the countries such as Poland, France, and to some degree Germany have huge agricultural sectors, which would be threatened by Ukraine's inclusion in the EU. Ukrainian agriculture is highly productive at a far smaller cost, and that might conceivably drive a whole host of farmers in these countries and these EU countries out of business. Again, that can be solved. The EU generally solves problems by throwing money at them. And it's conceivable that if it wanted to, it could simply bribe French farmers and Polish farmers in a variety of ways so as to elicit their agreement to Ukraine's membership. But all of these are obstacles. They have to be dealt with. So it's not going to be quite as easy as it was 20, 30 years ago for the East Europeans who joined. Ironically, if these countries, if Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria were to apply for membership today, imagine that they weren't, they probably wouldn't get in because of the various, forms of backsliding and regression regarding rule of law, democracy, human rights that many of them have experienced. But they're in, and Ukraine isn't, and the barrier has been lifted for Ukraine simply because it's a late applicant for membership.
Professor, we're just about out of time, but I do have a final question. What benefits would Ukraine bring to the EU as a result of full membership?
Well, primarily, there are two ways of looking at or of answering that question. One is it would bring stability to the EU. Like it or not, Ukraine is a critical country within Europe, and its ability to flourish economically, survive politically, militarily, and everything else is extremely important to the continued existence of the EU and of Western and Central Europe. So in that sense, bringing Ukraine into the EU would be a way of stabilizing relations within the EU, within Ukraine, and it would make the EU and Europe more secure. But that's a kind of negative addition. The positive addition is that Ukraine's agriculture is extremely efficient. That would cause problems for farmers in the short run, but in the medium to long term would benefit the EU. Likewise, Ukraine has advanced enormously in terms of computer technology, information technology, and certainly artificial intelligence. So it could bring know-how that the EU currently lacks. And of course, the know-how is know-how that Ukraine has acquired as a result of the war. But that having been said, it's still know-how that would benefit the EU enormously. So there are all sorts of reasons, both for and against, but mostly for.
Professor Motyl, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynica.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
I have been speaking with Professor Alexander Motyl, who's a professor of political science at Rutgers University, Newark, and an expert on contemporary politics in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. This episode of Krynica has been produced for the Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Until next time, that's all for now.